Rebecca, will you now, should we not allow the waiting room to start entering?
Exact 3,
Okay.
I'd say, yeah. We are live now.
Sandeepan, would you say? Yeah.
Okay. So, hello everyone. Good afternoon or morning or evening, whichever is more appropriate for you. I am Sandeepan, Director at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, or FAS as we are more commonly known as. On behalf of FAS, I warmly welcome you all to today's panel discussion on measuring poverty in India. The panel discussion is centered on a research article recently published in the Journal of the Foundation, Review of Agrarian Studies. The article titled Poverty in India, the Rangarajan Method and the 2022-23 Household Consumption and Expenditure Survey. Now, I would not take any time to describe or comment on anything. My job today is very limited to welcome you all with a brief introduction to the foundation. We are a more than 2 decades old research organization based in Bengaluru, India. Our major objective is to facilitate multidisciplinary theoretical and empirical inquiry in the field of agrarian studies in India and elsewhere in less developed countries. We do so in association with a wide section of people interested in the agrarian question, including persons associated with
farmers have their own seeds.
Okay. Sorry for that. We work in association with persons associated with academic institutions, but also members of mass organizations working in the countryside and other professionals and scholars. We consistently work to develop evidence-based scientific research to study and address one of the most important sets of issues in the contemporary developing world, the agrarian question and the conditions of life and work of people in the countryside. We have studied and restudied about 27 villages across 12 states in India as part of our village studies program. It's a unique endeavor to consistently study the Indian countryside through the lens of scientifically collected and systematically archived primary data. Using this data set and other important scientific methods, we have also studied a number of themes, including socioeconomic characteristics of Dalit households in rural India, women and work in the Indian countryside, the state of small farm economy in India, village panchayat level databases and their potential use in local administration, to just name a few. RLS, who is supporting today's event, has been a long-standing benefactor and a consistent support in many of our research efforts. Our research findings are regularly published as 2 book series, the Socio-Economic Survey series and Agrarian Studies series. We have published 12 books in the last 2 decades. We also publish a biannual peer-reviewed academic journal, the Review of Agrarian Studies, which is now running in its 4th year and holds international repute. Another important effort of the foundation has been to intervene in the discourse on development, rural and agrarian development in particular, through informed academic events such as seminars, conferences, and panel discussions such as this one. These events give a platform to both young scholars and subject matters experts. And today's event, hopefully, will be such an important platform. Without any further delay, I now hand over the proceedings to Professor Madhura Swaminathan, the chair of today's event, and request her to take charge of the proceedings. Professor Madhura.
Thank you, Sandeepan. And let me also welcome everybody on behalf of the Review of Agrarian Studies, which is now on the 14th year, not 4th, Sandeepan. So we are 14, volume 14.2 is the current issue. And I'll just say a few words, why did we decide to sort of have this workshop or discussion, panel discussion today? And I think that there's two, main reasons. One is that, the silence from the end of the officialdom. So for the last decade and more, we didn't have any, not only did we have no consumer expenditure survey, but we didn't have any discussion about income poverty or expenditure poverty. So I think we felt it is the role of academics, independent scholars, intellectuals, citizens to actually bring this back into the discussion and start talking about the extent of poverty, since neither the Niti Aayog, which has replaced the Planning Commission, nor Ministry of Rural Development, nor any ministry or department has thought it fit to try and arrive at estimates of poverty. The second and related issue, of course, is that the quality of official statistics has been on the decline. Official statistical system, as well as specific surveys. And this, of course, goes hand in hand with the first, perhaps, which is the neglect of statistics, because the organs of the central government are not interested in arriving at accurate estimates of the state of the Indian economy. And given all the events that have happened over the last decade, it's really rather sad that we are not having a discussion about how all the changes over the last decade have affected the living conditions of people and poverty. So that's why we felt it's quite not just enough to publish a paper which came out, but actually to have experts come and discuss this. Now, I'm going to give one representative of our three young scholars who have written this paper. C.A. Sedhu, who is at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, Abhinav Surya, who is at the Center for Development Studies, and C.A. Rudu, who is at the Kerala State Planning Board, to just give a brief introduction, 10 to 15 minutes of their paper, which I hope others who have not read it will be able to do so in detail after the discussion. And then we have four very distinguished panelists. I'm not going to read out CVs, that will take a long time, but we will start with Professor Gaurav Dutt, because it's quite late for him already in Australia, who many of you would have read about or read his work, as he was very much part of the team at the World Bank for many years that was involved in poverty estimation, along with Martin Revelion. And now he's at the Center for Development Economics and Sustainability at Monash University. Gaurav, I'm quite strict on time, so I'll give you 10 minutes. And then we will have Professor Himanshu from JNU for Center for Economic Studies and Planning. Again, Himanshu has written widely on many issues, but I think something that all of us insiders know is that he is one of the few experts on the national sample surveys and the statistical system in India as a whole, apart from all the other things he writes about, including the Palampur village studies. We will then move on to Dr. P.C. Mohanan, who has also known the National Statistical Organization and CSO from the inside, who had a career there, who ended as acting chairman of the National Statistical Commission, and then resigned when the 2017-18 results were not released, and is currently the chair of the Kerala State Statistical Commission. And finally, we have Professor Ramkumar, who is professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, and again is somebody who has written diverse subjects, but is really an expert on India's rural economy, different aspects of India's rural economy. So very happy to have such a distinguished set of panelists. So over to you, Sedhu, now, and the clock starts now.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Professor Madra. And Greetings to everybody who has joined this webinar, especially the panelists and the chair for today's session. I want to begin by thanking the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for providing such a platform to present our work. So I'll just share my screen now. And yeah, so I hope my screen is visible. So our work is, yeah, our work is basically, what I'll present today is about poverty in India as evident from the recently released Household Consumption Expenditure Survey of for 22-23. So this is actually based on a paper that was recently published in the Review of Agrarian Studies by three of us. So I am one of the authors. The other two are Abhinav Surya and Rutu. And in this presentation, I'll briefly discuss the context of our work and what we have done in the paper. So yeah, without delay, I think I'll start with the background in which this paper was written. So very recently, there is a growing narrative that consumption poverty in India has substantially declined now. Much of this narrative actually draws from this household consumption expenditure survey data that was released earlier in 2024. And so our paper is essentially an attempt to verify this claim by looking at this data very closely. So the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, or HCES, is the latest installment of national level household surveys of consumption expenditure that is carried out by the National Sample Survey Office of the Government of India. There is a long history of such surveys in India, and these surveys are quite straightforward in the sense that the investigators go to households and ask them about how much did they spend on a list of items, ranging from rice and vegetables to electricity to sports equipment and whatnot. So it is capturing consumption expenditure of households in a nationally representative sample survey. So these surveys have historically also been the source material for estimating poverty in India as measured by consumption expenditure, which is a proxy for income. But however, as Professor Madhura was saying, there has been a gap of over 10 years since data was released from such a survey. For more than 10 years, we did not have a good picture of what happened to consumption poverty in India. The release of the HCS data has now put an end to it, making it once again possible to see to estimate the levels of consumption poverty in the country again. So now, when we come to estimating consumption poverty from the survey data, there are two important methods. The first is the method of the expert group led by Dr. Suresh Tendulkar. And this is the last official method of estimating consumption poverty in India as of today. It was proposed in 2009. And a few years later, in the face of mounting dissatisfaction with the poverty figures derived with this method, the Indian government constituted another expert group chaired by Dr. C. Rangarajan to review this method of estimating poverty once again. But this is not unusual. Periodically, this has happened in India over the years. So the last time that poverty was estimated in India from these surveys was in June 2013, based on the consumer expenditure survey data of 2011-12. And this is available in a press note issued by the Erstwhile Planning Commission of India. They followed the Tendulkar Committee's method, but also noted that the Rangarajan Committee has been constituted to review this method. So as you can see, the Planning Commission found that 21.9% of the population was below the poverty line, which is in rural areas 816 per person per month and 1,000 rupees in urban areas, according to the Tendulkar Committee's method. Now, in 2014, the Rangarajan Committee submitted their report, and they re-estimated poverty from the same data for the same 2011-12 period. The committee estimated a higher poverty line, which is 972 in rural areas and 1,407 in urban areas, and they found 29.5% of the population as below the poverty line. However, the government did not adopt this report. So the Rangarajan Committee's method is an important method, and it is very close to an official method, but strictly speaking, it is not officially the way to estimate poverty as of today. Now, let's look at estimating consumption, the poverty from this survey data. So, before we do that, one thing we need to see is that there are three changes I would like to note of this survey from its predecessors. The first one I want to flag is that this survey followed something called the modified mixed reference period, which is basically just it refers to the recall period for the items that are being canvassed. So, like when I'm asking how much did you spend on milk in the last 7 days, it becomes. But if it is a non-perishable item like rice, it is 30 days. Whereas if it's a more durable item like clothing, it is 365 days. So this is an evolution of earlier methods, which is like the uniform reference period. As you can see, it's 30 days for everyone. And then there is a mixed reference period where durables were asked for 365 days. And now this is a modified mixed reference period. But the implication here is that what is relevant to us is that it is strictly speaking not possible to apply the Tendulkar Committee's method in a strict sense, because that method was actually developed for MRP and URP methods. Now, the second is that this new survey is more extensive and more elaborate in terms of the coverage of items, in terms of spending more time with the households by canvassing multiple questionnaires and multiple visits to each household, and also using the CAPI or like digital devices like tablets instead of pen and paper to collect the data. So these changes are good and welcomed as an improvement. But this cannot be said about the third thing I want to note, which is that there are some changes in the sampling design. I am not going to get into what these changes are. We can discuss in the Q&A if required. But I would note that several scholars have noted that the changes in the sample design has made it not comparable with the prior consumption surveys. In fact, some have even noted that the changes in the sampling design result in an underrepresentation of the poorest people in the sample survey, and therefore it results in an upward bias in the data. So we are not trying to get into this. We have, however, refrained from any comparison with earlier survey data. We are just trying to see what is the level of poverty that this data set shows. And that is basically our work. So now that all the background and context is laid out, let me introduce what we did. We basically apply the Rangarajan Committee's method to the HCES survey data, as it is the closest to an official method of estimating poverty in India that can be meaningfully applied to the new survey data. So, very briefly, what is the method of this Rangarajan Committee to estimate poverty? So, at its crux, they have basically divided the items that the survey canvasses into three groups. So, they are just food items, some essential non-food items, and everything else. So, the essential non-food items are identified as clothing, shelter, education, and travel expenses. So, for each of these items, each of these groups, there is a norm that is to be met, and the poverty line is the sum of each of these three norms. What happens is we have to meet, and this is calculated separately for rural and urban areas. So, in order to do this, the first thing we have to do is we divide the households into 20 fractals of monthly per capita expenditure, like monthly expenditure. So the first fractal class is the poorest 5% in terms of expenditure, and the 20th would be the richest 5%. So once we arrange them, these are the norms that the committee has prescribed. For food items, the nutritional norms for a healthy lifestyle or like for a healthy person that the Indian Council of Medical Research has prescribed, that nutritional norms in terms of calories, proteins, and fats. How much calorie, protein, and fat should a person consume to be considered healthy? The lowest fractile class whose expenditure meets these norms, like if I spend 500 rupees, I am able to meet the nutritional requirements. So that fractile class's food expenditure is the norm for the food items group. Now, for the essential items, which are clothing, shelter, education, and travel, the committee was of the view that this is important, and therefore the median fractile class, the expenditure of the median fractile class should be considered as adequate. Now, for the remaining items, they have decided that the corresponding expenditure of the fractile class which met the food requirements will be taken. So this will become clearer in this slide, where I will show you that when we did this for the HCES 22-23 data, the food expenditure norms were met by the fifth fractile class in rural areas and the third class in the urban areas. So this gives us this table basically. So the poverty line becomes 1248, which is the food expenditure of the fractile class that met it earliest, plus 480 plus 787. 480 because this is the median fractile expenditure. So 1048 plus 480 plus 787 becomes 2515. Similarly, in urban areas, it is 3600 and sorry, just a second, 3639. Sorry. So now this is next what we do is we have to convert these poverty lines at the national level into state specific poverty lines using what is called as using a Fisher index of a state relative to all India. And after we get the state specific poverty lines, the headcount ratios are then calculated at the state level specifically for rural and urban areas. The headcount ratios of poverty, like those who fall below the state level poverty lines. And this shows wide variations. For instance, in rural Kerala, the poverty headcount ratio is only 6.6%, but in rural Chhattisgarh, it is a staggering 58.9%. And in urban Telangana, it is 7.3%, but in urban Uttar Pradesh, it is 40%. Now, after this, the state level headcount ratios are added up in a proportional manner to the state's population to arrive at the all India headcount ratio of poverty. And the national figures work out to 27.4% in rural areas and 23.7% in urban areas, or an overall headcount ratio of 26.4. So this is basically what we calculated. This is the meat of our paper, and in our paper we have described these processes in even more detail. I request that you check it out. It's available at ris.org.in. There is no paywall. It's an open access journal. But now I want to come to this.
We have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'm almost done. So this is basically putting our calculated figures against one of the sources of the earlier narrative that I was talking about of substantial decline in poverty. The way that calculation is done is by adjusting the old poverty line of 972 with a consumer price index, which is used for measuring inflation. So what happens is this is evidently not an appropriate or like not an accurate way to track poverty. So I don't think, in the interest of time, I'm not getting into the details of why it is inaccurate, but in our paper we have discussed it, and feel free to ask questions. But the point is that when we actually recalculate poverty, you get a completely different figure. So yes, now I would just leave with two things for you to consider when you are thinking of poverty today. One is the evidence from other research, such as stagnating rural wages. There is a persisting agrarian distress, and now data has come out from the informal sector, which also shows that they are struggling. And the country just went through the COVID-19 pandemic. So what did this effect have on poverty is something we should consider. The second thing is that the whole exercise that I did is that I showed, it is still a very low threshold for poverty because it roughly works out to rupees 100 per person per day. And we are drawing that line in a data set that has a potential upward bias, that it is actually higher than actual, is the allegation. So even then, so a low poverty line in an upward biased data yet finds that 1 in 4 persons in India are living in poverty. So I think I would leave it here. Thank you for your time, and thank you once again for giving us this platform to present this paper. I welcome questions, and feel free to read our paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Sedu. We'll come back
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah.
So let me now turn over to our first panelist, Professor Gaurav Dutt from Monash University.
Yeah, thank you, Madhura, and thank you, Setu, for very nicely presenting your paper. So let me actually, since Madhura already admonished me that, I will have 10 minutes, I'll try to get right into it and hopefully meet the 10 minutes time constraint. So look, I mean, the background to this issue is, I think, Madhura already talked about it and Setu also mentioned, so I'm not going to go over it, except to just say that, poverty monitoring in India has gotten botched. And it's rather unfortunate, and the details of why it's gotten botched, I think, have already been covered. And even with the new survey now, the issue is still very much debated, leading people to talk about the Great Indian Poverty Debate. There was already a 2.0, now there's a 3.0 actually. 2.0 was already before this latest survey data became available. And the basic problem in terms of being able to make statements about, what's happened to poverty in India since 2011-12 is also already well covered by Setu. And basic problem is that the new survey is not comparable with the earlier one. And Setu already mentioned, and I think it's reasonably well known for people who've been following this debate, the main points of difference in between the two surveys. And essentially they come down to the three, and I'll repeat them only in the interest of making a point. So one has to do with the measure of consumption itself, and I'll come back to that. The second is the change in sort of the fieldwork protocols, if you like, and essentially number of visits to the household, 3 instead of 1, and the use of now this computer-assisted data entry process for which should actually, in principle, improve the quality of the data and reduce measurement error. And the third is, of course, change in the sample design. Now, let me just say that, in my own view, based on whatever I've been able to glean and read, is that in terms of the fieldwork protocols changes, it's hard to come out to assign a direction of bias. And I would actually venture to say that the same is also true of the sample design, although I think that needs to be probed a bit more. I know claims have been made by people that, there's an underrepresentation of the poor in the new sampling design. I'm not entirely convinced that's necessarily the case. But the biggest issue in my mind is actually the change in the measure of consumption. And there actually, I think there is a clear case of, there's a clear direction of bias in relation to that. And that comes from the fact that, the consumption survey has been expanded. Instead of 347 items, you have now 405 items, 58 new items, and some of the earlier items have been aggregated. There are some other changes as well. But it is, a 17% expansion of the consumption module. Now, this is something we know from earlier work on household surveys, that when you expand the consumption module, your measured consumption will increase. So that's sort of the big problem. I think that's the one change where you can actually, on the basis of prior work, definitely sign the direction of bias. an upward bias in consumption and therefore a downward bias in measured poverty. So what can be done? So, going back to the paper, I mean, I think my own view is essentially this paper is on the right track in the sense that if you take this the measure of consumption as the main source of bias, the sensible thing to do is what the paper does, which is that you apply the same. And let me actually backtrack a little bit by making a distinction between updating poverty line and setting poverty lines. Okay, so you can update poverty lines using a suitable price index, and that works most of the time. But you can also, the alternative is to actually reset the poverty lines, but using a consistent methodology. And which is what this paper tries to do. It's picked up the Rangarajan methodology. It's unfortunate they picked up the Rangarajan methodology, which I may have a brief comment on. But at least what it's trying to do is that, look, let's go to the basic principles of how poverty lines are set. And they are tied to the same norms in both the surveys. And if you implement those to actually reset the poverty lines, so this is not an updating of the poverty line, this is a resetting of the poverty lines, then you're likely to come up with more comparable numbers. Although the paper completely is shy of making the comparison, and I would be wanting to, for more ambitious attempts to actually go in the direction of making comparison, because that's the big question, actually. In the absolute numbers of poverty in 2023 by itself is of less relevance than the bigger question of, what's been happening over the 10 years. So I think we need to tackle that. And as I said, in my view, the authors are on the right track. It's unfortunate they picked on the Rangarajan methodology, which actually is highly convoluted and ad hoc in my view. A view also shared by Dres Sen. Actually, they were even less charitable towards their methodology. In fact, they wrote, this is a direct quote: "If you find it hard to find the justification, that is the justification for the Rangarajan methodology, if you find hard to find the justification for this method, don't worry, there is none." So I mean, I must say, I do find that, in fact, even the Tendulkar methodology and the Rangarajan methodology hasn't quite kept pace with the methodology of poverty measurement that's, more widely used, and there are many alternatives, of course, and we'll never completely settle on a unique methodology, but I think we want to stay clear of ad hocness. Now, how much that influences this statements about comparisons over time is unclear. So let me actually, I'm going to just, I don't know how much time I have left, another 2-3 minutes, maybe?
Couple of minutes, yeah.
Couple of minutes. So let me just end by then saying, look, given what it is, what can be done? So I think, if I haven't done this, and hopefully I can get my hands dirty and try and do it sometime. But if I were to actually approach this issue, what I would be wanting to do is really pick up the more reasonable cost to basic needs methodology of setting poverty lines. I would apply it both to the 2011-12 survey using the MMRP, because the MMRP numbers are available in the 2011-12 survey as well, and also apply exactly the same methodology tied to the same nutritional norms and a way of allowing for non-food expenditure consistently based on survey data, and apply the same to the 22-23 survey too. So and essentially using two key elements of that methodology are estimating a calorie price function and an Engel curve for food. The key is going to be to be able to use at least a subset of food items that are common to both the surveys. And I think there is, I think even despite some aggregation, etc., there'll be a certain large component of food expenditure which relates to items that are common to both surveys. And that's really the anchor for estimating, a calorie price function and an Engel curve. And once you have that, you have the basic ingredients for really setting a poverty line based on comparable norms for 2011-12, and the same norms being applied to 22-23. It doesn't solve all the problems. What it'll do is it'll give you a different estimate for 2011-12, because it won't be the Tendulkar or the Rangarajan line, it'll be the cost of basic needs line, but you'll also have a similar cost of basic needs line based estimate for 22-23. And it would be comparable in inverted commas. I mean, I think, again, it doesn't solve all the problem to the extent that sample design issues are serious enough. That methodology will not be able to take account of those kinds of issues. But my own sort of sense, as I said, was that I think it's hard to make the argument, at least I haven't seen it being made rigorously, that the sample design is definitely amounts to underrepresentation of the poor, like the way the argument was more rigorously made for the CPHS survey, the private survey, which of course, I think that was very clearly demonstrated by a number of people, including Jean Drez and so on. Himanshu may have a lot more to say on this. Let me stop here. And thank you again for the opportunity to talk about this issue.
Thank you, Gaurav. I think you've raised a lot of questions. I hope some of our other panelists and Himanshu was very central to the Tendulkar committee report. So maybe he can talk about that. But I think one point you said is, I think, is a good is that resetting the poverty line, because I think that was also part of when the Tendulkar committee came, that, just updating from some old line, leaves us all feeling very dissatisfied. Anyway, that was that was very helpful for me. Okay, over to you, Himanshu.
Thank you, Madhura and FAS for having this discussion. And thanks to Gaurav for having made some really blunt points, which I wanted to do it in a more polite way, but taking the cue from him, I will basically follow on with him. I think the first, in a sense, I agree with him very broadly, is that the whole sampling design issue is not that much of a problem. And in any sense, the NSS is quite careful in that sense. And sampling problems can be taken care of. They can be taken care of during the weighting diagram that is there, the weights which are there, the population adjustments, all those things are there. Really, the problem are the non-sampling errors, which are absolutely difficult to correct. And those are, again, not the CAPI. CAPI is not the problem as far as non-sampling errors are concerned. The problem is the multiple visits, the 3 visits which are there. And there, I think the NSS has been really very silent on what is the attrition rate, in the sense, as at least anecdotally, we know that there were people who were found in the first visit, but were not there in the second and third visit, which is likely to happen when there are seasonal migrants and other things. And also the respondents were not the same. Like, for example, you might have the head of the household, the father may be the respondent in the first visit, the mother will be in the second visit, and then the son will be, or daughter will be in the third visit. So these are complicated issues on which we don't have any clarity, and there is absolutely no way to get an idea on those issues. So non-sampling issues are, again, something which is very serious, and the issues of aggregation of items, new items and all that, much less, but they are also a problem which one has to look at it very carefully. But I do agree with Gaurav that this exercise, the SETU, is more like setting the poverty line, and it is not on updating the poverty line. And I want to bring back the Tendulkar committee in that sense, and then bringing the Rangarajan committee. Tendulkar committee's remit, in a sense, came from 3 important issues which were at that point. The Great Indian Poverty Debate had 3 important issues that were raised during that. One was the comparability of the recall period. The whole 99-2000 survey round, which tried with a different kind of recall period. The second issue was obviously the issue of normative norms, in the sense whether it should be anchored to the calorie norms, or how do we decide what is the cost of minimum meals and those kind of things. But the third important point, which was raised by Deaton in a number of papers, by Nodres, many others, was the issue of price deflators. That's an issue which is, again, a very important issue. On the issue of the recall period, that issue was taken care of, and Tendulkar actually suggested a very beautiful way of doing it, is that as long as you recognize that in a particular year, at a particular point of time, the total number of poor in the country are going to be the same. whether you are measuring it through URP or you are measuring through MRP or you are measuring through MMRP, the total number of poor in the country remain the same. What basically changes is that you are basically using different measures to arrive at. So you should actually be, whichever way you are trying, whichever measure, I mean, 2011-12 has both URP, MRP and MMRP. The way to do it is to have a poverty line which is to be applied on a particular consumption expenditure. So your consumption expenditure poverty line on URP will be applicable only on URP. The one on MRP will be applicable on MRP, and the one on MMRP will be. But all three should be designed in such a way that the total number of poor in every state and sector remains the same. That's the only way of taking care of this kind of a problem. But the changes in survey designs, I mean, the census recall periods have been happening over a period of time, basically because it's driven by the whole NSS kind of a debate. That's not a full solution to that, but that was something which was a way it was. The second thing which I think where Tendulkar committee spent a great deal of time was on deciding on the price deflators. That was an important issue which nobody talks about, but that's a very, very important issue. Because behind that entire exercise was a very basic principle, the very first principle of any poverty measurement. That as long as you recognize that the measurement of poverty is a money metric exercise, and this is what we are doing, it's a money metric exercise. It is not a nutritional exercise, it is not something else that we're talking about. And as long as it is a money metric exercise, you have to ensure that the value of the poverty line in any state sector is the same across all state sectors. Now, that is something which is a basic principle. Otherwise, you are applying different poverty lines to different states and different sectors and different individuals. So a lot of effort in the Tendulkar committee was basically in designing those, and a lot of explanation was also because of that. The Fisher price and the unit level data and all of those things are there. Those were quite complicated to calculate then, but now they're much easier to do because everybody has access to software and data and all of those things are there. And that once you accept that, then the Tendulkar committee was stuck with a problem of the normative norms in a sense. And that is where I think the Tendulkar committee did not convincingly argue the point that it was doing. And what people thought of that basically took it forward in a sense, the old poverty line, which was basically argued by the Tendulkar committee to that every time you change poverty line, the entire back series basically gets lost. I mean, you can't basically be changing it. So there has to be some continuity or some kind of linking has to be there so that people who want to do a long-term analysis should be able to have some kind of. Now that is where I think they were not very convincing, or at least they were not able to convince the larger population or people concerned with that in a big sense. But they did check the normative content of the poverty line in different ways. And they found it in multiple ways they were looked at using the NIN data and all sorts of data that they looked at. And it was found to be satisfying the criteria in many of them. So these three principles, remember that these are the basic issues. The Rangarajan committee, and I would say, is not just it's actually a very shoddy exercise in that sense. It's a very, very, I would say, a lazy kind of a way of doing it. Because the remit of the committee was to basically raise the poverty line whichever way you want to do it, and they basically did it. Now, a number of questions can be asked in that sense, which is obviously the nutritional norms. Interesting, and this is the point I want to reiterate again here. If you look at the Rangarajan committee, which went into all details of finding out what is the normative norms, all the exercise that Setu has also done for 22-23, at the end of it, their rural poverty line for all India was 933 rupees. The MRP poverty line for Tendulkar committee for 2011 is 912 rupees. They were exactly the same. In a sense, the Rangarajan committee vindicated Tendulkar's use of the poverty line, saying that these were actually sufficient for the calorie norms that they were applying in 2000. Then what else did the Rangarajan committee do? All the raising the poverty line happens not because of the food and the calorie component or the fat and protein and all of that. On all of those items, the Rangarajan poverty line and the Tendulkar poverty line are exactly the same. What the Rangarajan committee did, and this is a sleight of hand which was done, is to basically use these four essential non-food items, which is again a very arbitrary construct. You have education, but you don't have health. I don't know for what reason. You have clothing, again, I don't know. The rent and conveyance were basically kept out of the Tendulkar committee for a very particular reason, for measurement of the Fisher index, not for normative norms. simply because the rent data is not available in the rural areas. It's not collected in the rural areas, imputed rent. And conveyance is again because there is no price data which was available. So it kept out for the Fisher index, not from normative norms in that sense. Now here what we're doing is that we're looking at the poverty line class, and you are basically the median class expenditure. So all the increase that you see between the Nugul committee and Rangarajan committee is essentially that. And for these 4 items, which are pick and choose, because you have education, I understand, but why not health? I mean, why is it that health is not something which is an essential expenditure in that sense? That's what was basically done. The end result, which nobody noticed, and many of us were not saying this simply because, I mean, in any case, it didn't become official in that sense. If you look at the rural and urban in 2011 Rangarajan Committee report, poverty lines, there are majority of the states where the urban poverty estimates are much higher than the rural poverty estimates. In majority of the states, in UP, in Rajasthan, in Bihar, in Andhra Pradesh, in many states. Now, technically it is possible. Nobody knows how whether urban, but if you say, look at state like Bihar, where 90% of the population is poor, I mean in rural, and only 10% of the population, this is 2011 census, is urban. And if you're saying that the percentage of poverty in urban areas is much higher than compared to the rural areas, and anybody who has was done a survey in Bihar and has looked at the rural areas in Bihar, I mean, it's very difficult to convince. And the differences is not like minor differences. There are huge difference, 10 percentage point, 15 percentage point. Same with UP, same with other states. So it basically ended up running into producing a kind of an estimate, which was difficult to justify from any data that you look at, any secondary data that you're looking at. So that I think is where the Rangarajan committee. Now, that's where Setu's exercise becomes important. Now, what Setu has done is exactly what Tendulkar had warned about. Setu has basically looked at and created a calorie poverty line again for 22-23. Now, the problem here is that every time you're doing this, the price equivalence is lost. The poverty line basket of 22-23, which the Setu has got, it is not exactly the same in purchasing power parity terms in 2011-12, because the norms have changed. The population structure has changed. The demographic structure has changed. The NIN norms have changed. Everything has changed. So it's not a comparison. You can say that, okay, this is the poverty in 22-23, but you cannot make a claim that the poverty changed from 2011-12 to 22-23, because then every year you will have a different poverty line. Because every year the underlying structure on which the poverty lines are calculated is changing completely. So the basic point that Tendulkar was talking about is that you are going to measure, you're not measuring people on the same yardstick, at least on money metric terms, which is the primary way of measuring poverty. If that is not taken into account, then this is a method of basically setting the poverty line every time an consumption service is available. So 23-24 will be going to be available. You do the exercise again, then again you do the exercise again, and I keep on doing that. But that is also a problem in the rural and urban equivalence of it. The same poverty line bundle is not the same. If you do the price equivalence of that, you don't find that same kind of a problem, and you'll run into a problem. And I was looking for Setu's paper, and I found that he given the poverty lines, he hasn't given the state level poverty estimates for 22-23. And I don't know whether that was deliberate or that was just a oversight, because that was something which would have been actually, because I wanted to check the same thing that in the Rangarajan committee, where you have the majority of the urban areas reporting very high poverty compared to the rural ones, the same thing he's getting in 22-23 or not. But I found that this is something which was missing, and I would be happy to have that.
I think he can share that.
Yeah, because that was something which is not there in the paper, and which was, I didn't know. I mean, why would anybody do that and then present everything by state-wise, but only that particular information is not presented in the paper, was something which was missing. But I think we are back to the same questions, and I'll end here by simply saying that the 3 issues which I think were raised because of this, the Great Indian Poverty debate started in a sense. One is, what is the normative content of a poverty line? And the Tendulkar committee was not able to justify it. And I think Gaurav's suggestions in that sense of having a relook at the whole exercise is there. But on 2 other points, I think I would still say that the Tendulkar committee suggestions as well as Tendulkar committee's contributions in that sense. One is that once you arrive at the poverty line, and you agree that it is a monometric poverty line and you're not measuring nutritional one, then having the appropriate price deflators is the most important thing. Otherwise, you're not going to apply the same yardstick, poverty lines in rural urban areas or across states. So that is where I think that the rural committee's contribution is something which needs to be there and has to be stuck to. We need to really be insisting on those ones. And the third thing I think in that sense is that we need to have some clarity on these non-sampling errors. These non-sampling errors are going to become more and more, and therefore one needs to have some kind of a way of resolving this. Unfortunately, there is no way of resolving these questions. But I think the two remaining issues in that sense do remain. And I'll end here is that the Rangarajan committee in that sense was very, very emphatic in that sense. And in the report, it basically says it very, very clearly. They endorsed the Fisher committee. In fact, their state line poverty lines are using the Tendulkar committee Fisher indices. They are basically following the same price indices too, because you need that price index to go from national level poverty lines to the state level poverty lines. And they also suggest that same thing, that you should carry it out for updating the poverty line. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Himanshu. I'll let you run over time, but I think many of the young people may not have seen the original Tendulkar committee report, which was very thin, but then we knew the whole exercise, as you say, of arriving at suitable price deflators was very, very central to that. And it's important that our young scholars can be made aware of that and they can re-estimate this. When it's time for the discussion, I will ask Sedu or one of his colleagues to speak about the very interesting point you raised about the rural-urban differences in the headcount ratio. But I think now over to Dr. Mohanan. I think, from the lion's mouth, shall we say, he can talk about the various issues in the statistical system. Over to you.
Thank you, Madhura. I'm happy that Dr. Himanshu and Dr. Gaurav has mentioned all the technical things about the poverty, which I'm not competent to speak on. Having spent most of my time in the data collection work of this, I will concentrate and try to speak something on those issues. Because the poverty has been a subject of research and debate all along, we know. And the great Indian poverty debate itself came because of the change in some of the survey methodologies that we did in 1999-2000 kind of thing. And then we had all those discussions. But since then, I think we didn't have a stable, accepted kind of a poverty number. Because of these debates have created a kind of environment, where all kinds of possibilities have come to play. But looking back, when we started in 1960-61, the Landekar and Dark paper, if you see the consumer per capita expenditure that came from the national income side and the NSSO per capita expenditure, these two are almost same. Rather, NSSO was 278 rupees and the CSO figure of per capita household expenditure was 276, 2 rupees lower than that. So basically, the first 20 years, there was no issue up to almost 1980 or so, because a lot of things depended on the methodology of the CSO and estimating the national account, which was. So where the divergence came because they were not expanding the scope of the horizon or the boundary of economic activity in the national accounts. And since that, the difference between the CSO figure of per capita expenditure and NSSO thing is almost now NSSO is just half of the CSO's per capita expenditure. That is what the discussion came of. Otherwise, things were almost quite okay in the first 20 years of this poverty estimation. And we all know that the poverty estimation also did not require the kind of efforts that the young researchers have done now, because it was a matter of just updating the poverty line and then finding the cutoff from the MPC distribution of the NSS report. But then let us see the issues that came up basically in the data collection, and that has been mentioned by Dr. Dutt also, some of these issues there. One was basically the record lapse, when people assume there's a record lapse. But there I would slightly differ from Dr. Dutt, because the list of items given in the questionnaire is not the actual thing. Nobody in the field ask only on those lists. And in fact, people don't even, when the printed schedules were there, and you know that certain item listed in West Bengal is not consumed in Kerala where I stay. Normally, this never asked in Kerala. So the list was basically an indicative kind of thing all the time. The instruction booklet used to have many more examples. That is where the use of a CAPI kind of instrument, I'm not sure, I have not seen how it functioned in the field. I do not know whether the CAPI will allow you that kind of flexibility to more probe into the particular item that is consumed. Because that particular issue, I'm worried about CAPI. When you have a pen and paper thing, there is quite possible to note down on the margins certain things and then keep it aside. So CAPI may not actually do that. So that is one thing. But more than that, all of us know that if you questionnaires, if you divide the schedule into blocks and visit multiple times, it improves the response rate, absolutely. Because the time I have seen myself that, the durable blocks used to be in the last part of the questionnaire, and the last part of the questionnaire, all are tired. The investigator is tired, the respondent is tired. So the durable question, we always knew that durable goods were slightly underestimated. Now they have actually followed a practice of randomly allocating the schedules to different households. In one set, you ask the durable good first, and then after 1 month, you go for food. And so that kind of thing is done. So the least they could have done was, the NSSO could have done was to have one subsample where all the 3 blocks were canvassed together, so that you had one estimate to see how this would have been different had you followed the earlier kind of thing. But that unfortunately was not done in the this particular round. So you have that issue of not knowing that if had you asked everything from the same household, what would have been the impact of that? That is not possible to do that. But in the past, whenever a lot of experimentations are done on the recall thing, 7 days and 30 days, and I still remember, giving a household 1 kg of salt, and after 7 days, trying to weigh the salt packet and see how much actual salt they have to consume, because salt was considered as invariant, whether you are. So that kind of detailed experimentation is done, and we have seen that a 7-day difference period increases the actual consumption reporting, and all those studies are already there. I don't have to get into that. So but over the years, the diversification of the consumption has happened. You have more and more different type of consumption. And in this particular round, what is not mentioned, even there is another attempt to impute the consumption. There is almost parallelly they have collected the imputation. Certain items are actually provided by the government, like the computer, laptops are given to the poor people, mobiles are given, and many. So there is an effort this time to find out what is the imputed value of these items. So there is another set of MPC given using the imputed values, which would actually increase the MPC further. I mean, that Ritu and others have not looked at that, because you could basically have one more poverty line if you consider the imputed thing. But this was not there in the earlier thing. Earlier, certainly the imputation was not, it was done in a few cases, but it is not a separate kind of a block for imputed value. So this multiple reference period, multiple interviews were actually okay, because based on the long years of field work, we know that the canvassing the whole questionnaire in one go is simply not possible. And that is taken care of. But the sampling design, I don't think that would be, as already rightly mentioned by Himanshu and Gaurav, I don't think there will be any bias brought in by the sampling design into this war and all that. But more so, this kind of an imputation thing would actually affect the calculation. So the field issues, whatever they've done is right. I would not say that you cannot go back to that thing. So that is all fine. But my main concern with the present paper is, as already mentioned by others, do we recompute the poverty line every round? That is what actually they've done. And then if you follow the method of Rangarajan's method, so there is what I was just finding from the data was, see, if you look at the contribution of the non-food part in the poverty line, in the Rangarajan 2011-12 estimation, non-food component in the poverty line was 43% in terms of rupees for the rural area and 53% for the urban area. This was the 2011-12 poverty line. Now the paper by Setu and his friends, it shows that this share from 43%, it has become 50% now, 50.4%, the non-food share. And the 53% share for urban areas becomes 60% now. So the new poverty line is a much larger share of this, which is quite okay because non-food consumption will keep on going. So if you are revising the poverty line for every round, there would be this issue of poverty line itself going up without any of those considering the poverty. And second thing I found is interesting is the share of non-food expenditure in the consumption for urban areas is 61%. And what they get in the poverty line is also 61%. So the share of non-food expenditure in both poverty line, the below, and the overall population is almost the same thing. So which is also required. So if you continue the exercise for a longer period, how do you estimate the poverty line? All right, but I must congratulate them because my own hunch is that not many people who do this kind of a computationally complex work actually. That is why I think everybody went for updating the 2011 poverty line. That is the easiest thing to do by CPA rural urban and then use the MPC. But they have done a much more elaborate exercise of recomputing the poverty lines. So I personally think the poverty debate is not going to end here. Basically, this will be a good contribution to the debate that is likely to happen in future. And a lot of that is going to do with the data. Actually, prices and other things are okay. But comparability will come with the data. And that we cannot blame them because the NSS cannot keep the same methodology for data collection. But this particular thing, the impact of having 3 schedules, all of us know it will certainly increase the reporting, but it would have been better to have an idea about how much of the increase is contributed by that.
Right.
If they had a subsample of respondent where the old schedule is canvassed or canvassed. So I would stop here and then wait for it.
Thank you. Thank you. And I hope we have another round quickly with the same methods. Then, we will have
it is already there. It is already there. 23, 24, they've done it, I think.
Okay. That's excellent because then we don't have to talk about all these changes. But I think also you have emphasized some new points that, technology is changing, consumption habits are changing. So some change in the questionnaire is expected, and how does one incorporate that in our estimation of what constitutes poverty. So over now to our last panelist, Professor Ramkumar from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Welcome.
Thank you, Madhura. Thank you, the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, for organizing this and inviting us for this panel discussion. Let me begin by saying that the paper that is under discussion today is very meticulously done work. I congratulate the authors for entering realms which many were sort of fearing to tread, and in some sense setting a new standard, I must say, on how to look at some of these issues. I mean, there are issues, as I shall mention in a while, but I think this is a very important step forward and must be wholeheartedly welcomed by all. Let me begin by saying that there is, I will not get into these issues of sampling design and others, which my earlier panelists have spoken about, but what is the claim? That is, I want to start from there. What is the official claim? Is the official claim that poverty has been eliminated, or is it that extreme poverty has been eliminated? I think this is an issue that we need to start from, because if you look, there is no I have not seen a paper which sort of pegs the poverty estimate or headcount ratio in 22-23 at less than 5%. There is this press conference of BVR Subramaniam, where he actually makes the following point. He is actually taking a 32 rupees per day poverty line of 2011 prices, and he's saying, I am updating it to rupees 60 per day at 22-23 prices. And at rupees 60 per day, I find that the poverty is less than 10%. And if and when he adds the free food transfers during COVID, this less than 10% will become less than 5%. That is because it is in the second 5 to 10% class that he finds the average to be closer to his rupee 60 per day poverty line. So it is important to note that Subramaniam is saying it is rupee 60 as like if you keep poverty line at around rupee 60 per day, and if you calculate free food transfers during COVID and monetize it and add it, then you get less than 5% poverty. That is his claim. There is another claim which is more, where you can understand the methodology better, is by Surjit Bhalla and Karan Bhasin. It is available in the Brookings Institution website, where they say that we have eliminated extreme poverty. Now, that is another claim that is which is not cited in the paper, but which is a parallel claim out there, where they actually use what the $1.9 poverty line of the World Bank and call it extreme poverty in their paper, while World Bank actually calls it the global poverty threshold or international poverty line or whatever name it is now known as. Now, this is because this 1.9 poverty line in 2011, 12, 10, and so on was considered a very important poverty line for India because it happened to be, by chance, very close to the Tendulkar poverty line in those years. Now, that is actually the reason that Surjit Bhalla and Bhasin cite also for using as a justification for using that $1.9 poverty line, because it is closer to the Tendulkar poverty line of 2010. And Kaushik Basu has said that this was a very fortunate circumstance of inside the World Bank, where the $1.9 in 2011 happened to be coincidentally close to many poverty lines of the developing world, and hence nobody wants to leave that 1.9 benchmark in any form. Now, so in fact, to quote Kaushik Basu, he calls it the strange alignment of stars, whereby 1.9 became some magically equal to the Tendulkar line. Now, there is a problem here, which is that this 1.9 is actually, Bhalla himself calls it an extreme poverty line, right? So it is the elimination of poverty and all is not there. Probably we can say that elimination of extreme poverty, we are closer there if you use the $1.9 poverty line. But even there are two additional problems, which is, first, that this $1.9 poverty line has already been updated using the 2017 International Comparison Program, which is now $2.15 per day. World Bank itself has officially updated it. And there is actually one more ICP coming of 21 revision, which when it comes, it might actually even go up. So the PPP equivalent of the 1.9 poverty line is around 48 or 49 rupees per day. Now, if you make it 2.15, it becomes 53 rupees per day, slight upward revision. So Bhalla is talking about a 49 rupees per day poverty line. Subramaniam is talking about a rupees 60 per day poverty line. And let me say, Setu et al. Are talking about an 83 rupees per day poverty line in rural areas, if I simply divide it by 30. Now, so there are three different lines in question here. Bhalla is talking about extreme poverty. Subramaniam is talking about poverty after considering the free food monetization during COVID. And Ritu and Abhinav are talking about a very different poverty line. And that is the reason why you get differences, because the funny part is, if you convert the 1.9 poverty line into a $2.15 poverty line, World Bank estimates actually show, in fact, you're increased by 4 or 5 rupees per day only. World Bank shows that 11 million people will be newly poor in India if you make that 4 rupees, 5 rupees increase per day. And there's a World Bank paper, working paper on this, which is available online. Now, this is the first point that I wanted to make about the lines that are being used. The second point I wanted to make is about Rangarajan and Tendulkar. Now, I'm not a fan of either. May I say, I think Tendulkar is written with much more contradictions than is accepted by many of the panelists. And the first point to make is Tendulkar the primary contradiction I see in Tendulkar report is that they reject the calorie norm and in the next breath accept it. They reject the calorie norm, but then they create a sort of, in my classrooms, I call it a Shah Rukh Khan, which is the guy standing on the urban poverty line, who is actually consuming a calorie amount of calorie, which is calculated by the same old calorie norm for urban areas. So you have not rejected it. You have actually accepted it and created a benchmark. Then how can you say you have rejected the calorie norm? So there is a primary contradiction there in Tendulkar report, and I'm sure they have done enormous amount of meticulous work on price deflators and so on, which is excellent. But I think this primary contradiction in commonsensical terms is indefensible. That is my first point. Now, this, and I'm not getting into the problems that Professor Utsa Patnaik and all have been making for a while, which is the arguing for a direct measurement of poverty in calorie terms and so on. She has been very unfairly derided as calorie fundamentalist and so on by some economists. And I think Ritu Setu Abhinav method is actually a return to a direct method, but in a monetized way. I think that's a very important contribution that they make. Now, let me continue here. So, and Madhura herself had pointed out at that point of time, I remember, that Tendulkar's use was of minimum dietary energy requirement of the FAO and not the average dietary energy requirement of FAO. As a result, this Shah Rukh Khan, who is standing on the urban poverty line in Tendulkar report, is consuming only 1777 calories per day. Now, is that the new calorie norm then? Tendulkar committee does not answer that basic point, that their benchmark is actually consuming only 1778, whereas no other benchmark is anywhere close to that. All of them are above 2000. Now, this is
Ramkumar,
first.
I'm giving you a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Yes. This is the first problem with Tendulkar. The second problem with Tendulkar report was that Tendulkar said that what the expenditure incurred by this 1777 calorie benchmark person includes, I insist, includes the expenditures on non-food, including education, health also. And that is how he arrived at this 32 per day line of those days. Now that is that. So these two problems of Tendulkar committee report were the reasons why this whole debate emerged at that point of time. There was affidavits in the Supreme Court and so on. That became the context for appointing the Rangarajan report. Now, what does Rangarajan do? I think Rangarajan did something which must be welcomed in principle. I don't think it should be called lazy and all that. Maybe the method was problematic. There are issues, but what they did was they went back to the calorie norm, included proteins and fats in the basket. Then they added two more items to it, clothing, rent, etc., and also non-food expenses, which would aid food consumption. So in principle, I welcome this addition of items to the basket. However, they made there were a lot of issues on how exactly to quantify it. Unfortunately, Rangarajan report reduced the calorie norm in a not so clear fashion as to they reduced the calorie norm for rural areas from 2400 to 2155 and urban areas from 2100 to 2090. So the difference between rural and urban normative requirements reduced from 300 to 65. Now there is no clear justification for that in the Rangarajan report. And the second important problem was that both in clothing and other expenses that they include, the median fractile is considered as adequate. What is actual is considered as adequate. And third problem was they considered only those non-food expenses which would contribute to food consumption and not other forms of non-food consumption. So these three problems meant that your calorie norm went down, but your proteins and fat went up. Probably that is the reason why you ultimately end up getting a very similar poverty line as to Tendulkar. But that's also just an alignment of stars and nothing else, to go back to Kaushik Basu's term. But the point is, I want to make this point and end the presentation, which is that Tendulkar report had two serious issues which are not defensible. The Rangarajan report goes ahead, makes a welcome change in its approach, but left a lot to be desired in terms of how to monetize it into an adequate poverty norm for a society like India. So Rangarajan poverty line is also a major underestimate in terms of poverty line estimation. And the fact that Ritu, Setu and Abhinav get a 25% poverty in India, even on that destitution line, is a matter of shame for the those who say that India is a growth story, miracle, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramkumar. I think you ended with highlighting a very important point that if we went by Niti Aayog or I never cite Ashok Gulati, but problem is almost solved in India. But we know it's not solved, and therefore I think we have a lot of young people listening in today. How best to find suitable methods to estimate poverty with available data is a very important question. Now we have a lot of questions coming up. One very quick question I will put to the speakers before we gather the others, which says NSS has not released a calorie chart. So how have you arrived at, would one of the authors like to respond to that?
Yeah, hello.
Yes, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so it is true that there is usually a nutrition chart that the NSSO releases after each consumption survey, where a subcommittee decides after deliberation based on the Indian food consumption tables, the calorie, protein, fat, etc. Contents of each food item. The NSSO has not, the last report to come out was for CES 2011-12. We have not, there is no new report. So what we have done is we have used that report, and we have managed to have a concordance with the additional items. It is not too different in terms of food items. So that is what we have done. Yes, so that's, I hope that's clear.
Okay. Can I also ask you to come in on the question that Himanshu raised about urban and rural headcount ratios?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to, yes. So, firstly, yes, this is a criticism that we had seen, and there's a lot of criticisms in our paper also. We have also mentioned some of our apprehensions with the method. But the point is, yes, we have first of all, yes, we have the state level figures available. We can make it available. It's not an issue. It's that, and it reflects what Professor Himanshu was saying, that in many states, urban poverty levels are higher than rural poverty levels according to this method. And that is probably because of issues germane to the very method itself. I also wanted to say that the reason why we decided to emulate, to follow this method is just that we felt it was the most since we couldn't think of a way that the Tendulkar method could be made applicable to this data, we thought this was the next most official method to see. And our larger point was to show what Professor Ramkumar said in the end, that no matter how you look at it, even with all this kind of a method, all this kind of a data issues, there's still substantial poverty that remains in the country. So, yeah.
Would any of your co-authors like to come in?
Yeah, may I, Professor Madhura, Abhinav?
Yes, please go ahead, Abhinav. Yeah.
So adding to Sedu's point, and to add to, to kind of ask a clarificatory question to Professor Himanshu on the point of, Professor Dr. Tendulkar's method of updating the poverty line. So we also agree that Dr. Tendulkar has indeed offered a good method to update the poverty line. Essentially, we based on our reading, it's based on arriving at a Fisher index. But for this purpose, we need quantities, I assume. So, and we can do this properly for, say, food consumption. But unfortunately, it's not the case for most of the non-food commodities. So currently in the liberalization period, there is a squeeze on people's consumption growth, particularly due to increase in prices of non-food commodities with the privatization drive and all those things. So we wanted a clarity from you and other experts as well as to whether application of even Tendulkar's method to update the poverty line, is it ideal? And especially considering that there is a long gap of over a decade, is it an ideal method to do it? So we wanted a clarity.
So you are asking the panelists to reply. I don't know if Himanshu is...
No. That's a good one, actually. See, this is I think a panel and a platform
yeah.
where I'm sure Mr. Bhalla is not participating or Mr. Gulati is not there, joining in. So it's not a point question of the poverty lines being the appropriate ones. I agree fully with Ram Kumar on that point that it's a shame that we have so much, and the rural distress and all of those issues are well known. I mean, we all have been on saying this for quite some time. And there is obviously a need for revision of the poverty lines, which is what the Nilkar committee also suggested, and this is something which was there. We should be doing it. We have been doing it. I mean, there was Ladda committee, Laddawala committee, and then various other committees before that, and after that, it has been happening. And we should do it to update those issues. I think the question which is there is also the applies to, in a sense, the Nilkar committee's calorie problem. I can tell you very clearly, and Setu will understand it because he has done the exercise. Once you arrive at this is what let me tell you what Rangarajan did. Rangarajan got it for the national poverty line.
Himanshu, you've got to be brief. Huh?
No, just a simple, the national poverty line. The question is, how do you go from state to the state, national poverty line to the states? You need a price deflator to do it, or you do the calorie exercise every state. The Rangarajan committee did not do that kind of exercise. It simply took the national ones and did that. And that's where Ram Kumar will understand the problem with the calorie one. If you do the exercise state by state, you'll get a completely different number. Setu will also have the same problem. He will not be able to get the same numbers which is getting at the national level. So that's a conundrum that is why Tendulkar was not getting into this full calorie thing and saying the price deflators are very, very important, because remember, ultimately we are measuring poverty on money metric. It's a money metric poverty line. So all those issues that we are talking about on prices, unit values, is there in the Tendulkar committee. Also for non-food items, there are unit values, there are quantities, there are prices, and the entire method is spelled out very clearly. You can anybody can calculate those poverty the Fisher price deflators in that sense, and it has to be updated. I'm not saying use the same ones, but the price deflation part is not an trivial part. It's a very, very important part of it. And that's something which I would reiterate, and that's a problem that will be there for Situ also in this exercise also.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there are some other questions in the chat box which have probably been answered in the discussion. One of them is, what is the current BPL rate in India? I think what we're talking about today is really, there is no official estimate of poverty. There is a multidimensional poverty index, which is something very different, because and I think this is also something that I think those of us interested not just in measurement, but in actually the concern for the real problem of ending poverty, is that unlike the Human Development Index, there's no income or expenditure measure at all in the multidimensional poverty index. Is entirely, based on other indicators of housing, health, education, etc. So we need to bring back the money metric in some way, even if not, basing all our understanding on just using that. There's also a question about, I'm not sure if it's relevant, about poverty and inequality that has been asked by Achari, R.V. Achari. And she's comparing it and saying even the person in the lowest category is getting only 1/7 of what a Chinese person gets. So I think these are comments that we can, the authors can respond to later. Thank you for that. And I would like to throw in a question here which has been raised, that the sampling errors and non-sampling errors, and I think we have to see how to deal with them. And Gaurav, you had mentioned that there is, people have been, when you said we know that increasing consumption items will increase estimates, is that based on some studies in other countries? And while you answer that, is there anybody else who would like to come in? Please let me know if there are any more questions. Yeah, Gaurav?
Yes, actually, that is something that's based on research. I mean, I won't be able to cite the papers straight off, but yeah, we do know if you increase the number of items in your consumption module, measured consumption tends to increase. So that's sort of reasonably well known. And same, so that's, I think that's, to my mind, that's certainly a significant concern. But that's the one concern, at least in my mind, there is a reasonable way to address it. In fact, this goes back to, I think it's still unpublished, an old paper by Jenny and Peter Lagneau on estimating poverty with non-comparable data. I don't think it ever got published, or at least I haven't come across a published version. And essentially, they are right in actually, and one can derive it, and I've actually been able to derive mathematically as well. If you have two non-comparable measures of consumption, but they contain a subset of comparable items, and then I think it is possible to essentially use a cost of basic needs methodology, which will essentially set the poverty lines in such a way that actually the headcount index will be exactly the same. But of course, in this case, it won't be the same because the surveys are for different time periods. But supposing you had a subsample, that would of course be the cleanest way of doing it, but also for checking this empirically. If you had a subsample where they use the new methodology and the old methodology, then obviously you establish a link, which is in fact a lesson. That's the strangest thing that NSS, somehow simplest thing to do that they haven't done, which is very unfortunate. And because survey methodologies will change in the future too. So in fact, they might as well actually take that as part of their job. That whenever they make a change, do a bloody subsample. Sorry, pardon my language.
Thank you. I think, Gaurav, you're getting worked up.
But the other thing I was going to say is that also allows you to check for this particular theoretical result.
Yeah.
That
I'm going to have to close down now.
That's a bit technical, so
But I think I don't know. I think if there are some NSS people listening in, and if you have another round which is coming out with a similar methodology, perhaps that would be help. Just one quick question to any of the panelists. The young scholars want to know if there's any book you can recommend on how to study and measure poverty. So any suggestions, Himanshu, Ramkumar, any?
I think the beginning could be the Great Indian Poverty Debate by Angus Deaton and Valerie Quizzel, the dated volume. That's quite a comprehensive summary of issues in poverty measurement.
I think they can start with Dandekar and Rath, and then the next one would be the Great Indian Poverty Debate.
And
there are also interesting manuals of the World. I mean, there's a 2017 report of the World Bank which looks at relooking at poverty lines and so on. It's I've always found it a very useful resource for students. Software you have to learn separately. I mean, that is we cannot deal with that here. But the other thing to note is I think I've not read the book, but I think Martin Trevelyan had a very recent book on the history of poverty estimates or something. I think the title was something like that. I've heard very good reviews of the book, but I've not read it myself. So I think it might also be a very useful resource for students. Thanks.
Thank you.
There's a lot of work that Indian economists have done. We must not.
You have to read a lot of papers for that. No one.
That's right.
That's right. And I think there's a question which is, I think, again, some young scholar has asked that, how do we really measure poverty? Because they've seen that the panel has had so many comments from different sides. Each of the poverty lines that have been used in India have had their own problems. But, as someone, I would say, if I could be allowed to answer that, is I think there's no one answer. One has to use a consumption poverty estimate along with other indicators, like whether it's rural wages or whether it's housing conditions or nutritional norms. One can't arrive at a complete picture of poverty by just using one measure. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca to close the session.
Thank you, Professor Madhura. I'm Rebecca, the coordinator for communication and events at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. I will now take just a couple of minutes to extend the vote of thanks on behalf of the Foundation. Let me begin by thanking Setu CA for presenting the findings of their paper so effectively. The discussion that followed was engaging and thought-provoking, offering valuable perspectives for all of us. I would also like to thank our esteemed panelists, Dr. Gaurav Dutt, Dr. Himanshu, Dr. P.C. Mohanan, Dr. R. Ramkumar, for enriching the conversation with their incisive observations and expert analysis. A heartfelt thanks to Professor Madhura Swaminathan, for chairing this event, guiding the discussion with her thoughtful comments and expertly moderating the session. A special thanks to the online team of the Foundation, Sandeepan, Tapas, Setu, Mukta, Daya, and Ritika, for their dedicated efforts in coordinating and managing the technical aspects of this seminar. We are also grateful to Nikita and Sai for their expert support with social media outreach, and to Rahul from the free software movement in Karnataka for his technical assistance during the event. Our sincere appreciation extends to our academic scholars and research collaborators whose efforts in sharing information about this event contributed significantly to its reach and participation. We would also like to thank Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia for their continued support, which has made this panel discussion possible. Finally, we are truly grateful to all the attendees for their active participation and engagement, which brought life to today's session. To learn more about the work of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, please visit our website at fas.org.in. We also invite you to follow us on social media: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, where you can find us under the handle FAS Agri Studies. These platforms will help you keep updated on the initiatives of the Foundation. With this, we come to the end of the session. Thank you, and we look forward to your continued participation in our upcoming events.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And a recording will be available. Some people were asking about it.
Yes, yes, a recording would be made available.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you all.
And we would also
Thanks.
make available these questions to all the panelists, all the questions in case they want to continue engaging with them.
Since the video is live, it will be available right away on YouTube.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye
Bye.
then.
Right.